Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hall. Today we are talking about Wallace Thurman, author of The Black or the Berry. And we're going to talk about his life and some of his influences in this presentation. And then in the next video, we'll get into The Black or the Berry a little bit more in depth and look at some of its themes and other aspects as well. So let's get started. Thurman's early life. There he is, looking very dapper in his hat. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1902, he was abandoned by his father and he suffered from very poor health through most of his life. This kind of climaxed at the age of 16 when he had influenza during the pandemic of 1918. A lot of people died from influenza at that point. He was able to survive, but it did leave him physically kind of still weak. So throughout his troubled childhood, he basically found solace in reading and writing. He actually wrote his first novel at the age of 10, which is extremely impressive, especially if you know any 10-year-olds, because usually they're not interested in that kind of thing. But he left for a pre-med program at the University of Utah, and then he transferred to the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. But he again left school before graduation, and this would not be unusual for the time. A lot of the other people that we've looked at so far are educated at Harvard and Columbia and NYU and things like that. But many people who became reporters and journalists actually did not complete college at this point. It was more like an apprenticeship kind of situation where you would learn from other people at the paper and become a skilled writer and journalist by learning from them, and rather than learning how to be a journalist and how to write articles in school. So he was a columnist for a Black-owned newspaper, and he really became celebrated as a journalist. He started the magazine Outlet, which was meant to be like a West Coast equivalent to the NAACP magazine that was popular in the East. And he continued to write and edit throughout his life. So he moved to New York City in 1925 and was a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance, editing The Messenger, which was a socialist publication for African Americans. This is the point of time where people are kind of talking about socialism and communism as some philosophical ideas that may or may not bear out, and this kind of comes to a head with McCarthyism, where a lot of the people who were involved in these things were then questioned by the government to see if they were, doing anti-American activities. But for the most part, it's these people are intellectuals who are sort of looking at these kind of ideas. That's just important to note. He also founded the literary magazine Fire, and in the words of one critic, his work on the magazine's, quote, challenged the notion that Black art should be a form of propaganda for white approval, claiming instead that Black art should reveal the reality of African American life. That's going to be extremely important to note as we talk about the book that he wrote, The Black or the Berry. He is writing in very much in the tradition of the Lost Generation about the seamier side or the seedier side of life in a really realistic way, looking at, you remember the Lost Generation is kind of looking at the world and saying, look, it fell apart. The morals of the old world don't work. It led to war and disaster with World War I, right? All of that kind of thing. And that is basically the type of thing that he's writing. And many other people at the time were trying to say, as Black people, as African Americans, we should show the best of our life and hold ourselves up, showing just the good parts, basically, so that we're accepted by white society. And he's saying that's not what art is about. It's not just for white people to look at it and appreciate. This is for us and our culture, and it should reflect that. In 1928, Thurman married and quickly divorced because of his sexuality. So he was arrested previously for homosexual activity and intercourse, and he tried to kind of cover up that arrest. And basically, we saw this with County Cullen as well, right? These are some rumors that kind of plagued him throughout his career. And I even hate to use the word plague, but at that time, that really was what it was like, right? That rumors about your sexuality could really destroy your life. He could have never worked again. He could have been blackballed, all of that kind of thing. However, we'll get into homosexuality in the Harlem Renaissance in a minute, because this is an artist community, right? These are writers and painters and musicians and actors, and some of them were gay and some bisexual and some, all of the rainbow, basically. So after publishing novels and debuting a play on Broadway, he died rather young in 1934 of tuberculosis and alcoholism. Kind of very unfortunately, because he was still really at the height of his career, and but he had been very sickly from a young age, and a lot of writers from the Lost Generation had complications from their use of alcohol, particularly if any of them were drinking during Prohibition, because a lot of the alcohol then is not regulated. So it's like, bathtub gin and stuff like that. I'm not saying that's what happened to him, but that's just what happened to a lot of people during the time. So many people believe that tuberculosis was kind of exacerbated by his drinking. So journalist Linda Villarosa wrote about homosexuality in the Harlem Renaissance, and she said that the period was, quote, as gay as it was black, and many figures, including County Cullen, Claude McKay, Wallace Thurman, Elaine Locke, Richard Bruce Nugent, Angelina Weld Grimke, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and Langston Hughes, all luminaries of the New Negro literary movement, have been identified as anywhere from openly gay, like Nugent, to sexually ambiguous or mysterious, like Hughes. So it's interesting because we see this kind of come up in some places because people were not open about their sexuality at that time. There's a lot of question with our author today. With Thurman, it's a little bit more apparent, but I think it's like an open secret, right? That this is kind of going on, but for the most part, people still would not have talked about it. As I said, he was arrested for it. Homosexuality and homosexual activities were criminalized. Many people were put into like sanitariums because it was thought of as a mental health disorder at that period of time. So 100 years ago, right, it's being looked at quite differently. In the 1983 essay, Tain't Nobody's Business, Homosexuality in 1920s Harlem, Eric Garber says, at the beginning of the 20th century, a homosexual subculture uniquely Afro-American in substance began to take shape in New York's Harlem. Throughout the so-called Harlem Renaissance period, roughly 1920 to 1935, Black lesbians and gay men were meeting each other on street corners, socializing in cabarets and rent parties, and worshiping in church on Sundays, creating a language, a social structure, and a complex network of institutions. So you can see cabarets, parties, rent parties, in apartments and things like that, and yet still going to church on Sundays. So kind of hiding it and having this complex network. A lot of this is reflected in Thurman's work, particularly his magazine Fire, but we're also going to see a little bit of it in The Blacker the Berry. Not a lot, but enough that I feel like it's noteworthy of and important to mention, because it does affect a lot of his work. Not only his sexuality, obviously, but the fact that he had to hide it. So I'm going to give you now an overview of his probably most famous work, the book, The Blacker the Berry, and I won't spoil the end, I promise. So, published in 1929, you note the date is important because this is after he was married and divorced. The book features Emma Lou Morgan, a dark-skinned girl who lives in Boise to a family of lighter-skinned African Americans. The messages that Emma receives about her father and her inherited dark skin color affect the rest of her life. Throughout the book, this is the dominant theme. And I chose this book for you because I think it's a really interesting look at not just racism, but also colorism. And we'll get into that more in the next presentation. She travels to California for college, just like the author did, right? Going to USC, and later comes to Harlem, all while facing colorism and discrimination from others. But the real struggles that Emma faces are internal, and she continually contends with internalized hatred for herself and her skin color, her race a little bit, but really more the complexion and the color of her skin. So one of the things that's interesting to me about this book also, besides the fact that it really features colorism within the Black community as opposed to racism from without the Black community, is that Emma is kind of an unreliable narrator she's not narrating, but we'll get into that. But she's an unreliable source of information in the book because her opinions are, for lack of a better word, colored by this experience or perceived injustice. So she becomes kind of at times a very bitter person, seeing things in a way that sometimes they're not. This cover of her dancing. So fun. So as a result of both the real prejudice and the perceived prejudice that she faces, she has really contentious relationships at school. She struggles to find steady work, even though she's a very bright girl and could be educated, and people encourage her to do so. She kind of flits around to various jobs. She later chases men who have issues with alcohol and are disinterested in her, and they're disinterested in her. She chases them merely because they are lighter skinned. So she herself has all of these internalized things, and there are men who are interested in her who seem to be better quality, but because they're darker, she rejects them. In particular, she falls in love with Alva, a player, basically. He's a manipulator, he's a con artist, he uses women for sex and money. The rest of the novel explores their relationship through several years. Emma Lou struggles with colorism, bitterness, low self-esteem, all of that. So, like I said, I don't want to give away the ending and tell you exactly what happens with Alva and Emma Lou and exactly all the details of what her struggles are and her travails and all of that. But in the next presentation, we'll get into a more in-depth analysis, and we'll look at characterization and narration and some of the themes and all of that. So stay tuned. Thanks.